into as human beings who are engaging in conflict, when there's emotionally charged things and there's things that we care about and there's a sense of unmet needs and all of that. How do we think of that? How do we make sense of that? How do we orient ourselves towards conflict? And the reason why I think that's so important is because that really then determines our behaviors and how we actually engage and show up in conflict. We first have to kind of question how we think about it and how we think of ourselves, how we think of others, how we think of the situation, the issues themselves. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time in that space today. And then towards the end, we'll have some more kind of practical things to consider. But I regret that with the time, we're not going to be able to go into that kind of deep dive that is sometimes nice in the practical application. But we'll at least scratch the surface in what I hope is a meaningful way. And then to the extent that folks are interested in more practical kind of tools and tips and tricks, if you will, around the idea of managing conflict in a productive way, I welcome you to follow up with me or with our office in general, the Ombuds office, because that's a big role we play here at the NIH, is helping people to think about how to do that, how to put some of these things that I'll talk about into actual practice with real life situations. So please do feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to share a little bit more about our office and what we do in just a second, and make sure you have our contact information. But before I transition into that and really get us started here, I just want to say a few things about, I see my screen went away. Somebody mentioned, can folks see it? Evan, are you able to confirm that my screen is okay, cool. So, you know, I've been doing Ombuds work both here at NIH and in the university, higher education, academia kind of setting for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years now. I did mediation work for the nonprofits. Before that, I studied conflict analysis and dispute resolution as an undergrad and graduate student. So I've been around the field of conflict resolution for quite some time, but I by no means claim to be the end-all, be-all expert. This is an ongoing experiment for myself as well. One of the reasons why I enjoy working in conflict is because it constantly challenges and pushes me, because naturally, I'm not the most, I was never the most effective person in conflict. I was naturally conflict avoidant or an accommodator, an appeaser. And I work really hard every single day to kind of work back from some of those natural tendencies and push myself and challenge myself to have difficult conversations, to be a bit more assertive about my own needs in conflict, to address things in meaningful and productive ways, to not avoid what feels uncomfortable. And so I can really appreciate what it means to do this work from, you know, a real perspective. It's easier for me when I'm working with others and it's their conflict and I'm not involved with it. When it's my own stuff, you know, I fall into some of the same traps and tendencies that we all do as human beings. And so I want to honor that. And I want to acknowledge that you all have experience in this topic, whether you like to admit it or not. As a human being, you've dealt with conflict at some point, and you likely will in the future. And so I say all that to say, I welcome that experience, that wisdom, that knowledge into this space. I don't want to just be a talking head up here. I'm sure I'll be doing a lot of that by nature of this kind of format and the time that we have. But I welcome your comments, thoughts, questions, reflections throughout the session. Feel free to interrupt me. Feel free to put something in the chat. I'll do my best to monitor that. And I'll also do my best to save some time at the end for just general questions and discussion. So I need your participation in this. There will be some points built in along the way where that's intentional, but don't feel limited to only those moments. Feel free to chime in at any point. If that all sounds good and there aren't any questions yet, then we'll go ahead and jump right in. Okay. So really quick, shameless plug about the Ombuds office, just so that you all are aware. There's quite a few people on this call, and I always like to take advantage of an opportunity like that to talk about who we are and what we do. I'll be very brief though. Just know that we are a resource for all members of the NIH community. That's federal employees, contractors, trainees, volunteers, Commission Corps folks, anyone. And we're here to help people work through a whole range of workplace challenges and conflicts and issues. We can provide options for how to address the situation depending on what your goals are. To the extent that you want to work with us further, we can offer a range of different informal strategies to try to address the situation. We can do coaching, we can mediate or facilitate conversations. We can explore other kind of problem-solving strategies or things that you can consider and you can do to try to address things at the lowest level possible. We help people build skills and strategies and capacity to resolve and mitigate conflict. And we're also paying attention to larger kind of structural and systemic patterns, themes, trends that exist here at NIH that create the conditions for conflict to happen in the first place. And we try to work with the necessary folks at NIH to pay attention to and address those kinds of things as well. So we work at all levels, organizational level, the individual level, everywhere in between with groups, all sorts of things. Our work is confidential, it's voluntary. We bring an impartial and objective perspective, and we operate in an informal way. As I mentioned, we don't do formal investigations or grievances or complaints or things of that nature. So that's just the kind of crash course in what we do and who we are. I welcome folks to reach out to us if you feel like you could benefit from working with us or you want more information about what we do. The contact information for our office will be on one of the final slides, which I'll make sure everyone gets a copy of. Okay. Yes, and that just came up. Thanks, Pamela. Yes, I'll make sure that there's a PDF copy of the slide that gets sent to everyone. All right, so let's get things kicked off here. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of conflict? You can put it in the chat, you can unmute yourself, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Don't overthink it. Just what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say conflict? All right, everything's pouring in. We got disagreement, anxiety, ick, anger, more disagreement, discomfort, avoidance, uncomfortable, problems, uncomfortable, anger, tension, confrontation, stress, people on different pages, more anger, war, yelling and screaming, stress, fight, hard, disagreement, run, anger, argument. All right, yeah, a lot of stuff here. Stress, more stress, my sister, excellent, nice, Paul. Unresolved, sadness, tears, negativity, tension, not good, fighting, stress, different perspectives, dishonesty, confrontation, negativity. Wow, trying to read as fast as I can here. Jealousy, job security. Whew, it's coming in. The floodgates are open. Excellent, thank you. Oh, compromise, that's kind of interesting. Nice. Something relatively positive in there, which is the point, right? So if you see, I just asked this question, the first thing that comes to mind, I think most of us can probably agree as you scroll through the chat, this list is overwhelmingly what we would probably call negative in some way, right? Like these aren't things that we necessarily enjoy. Stress, tears, adversity, tension, bullying, negativity, issues, all sorts of things, fear, confusion, hiding, avoiding, not stuff that we typically enjoy. And there's good reason for that. And, you know, because a lot of our immediate kind of experiences with conflict, when we reflect on it, is something that's challenging, something that's difficult, something that's typically negative. Most of us, although there are some folks like this, aren't out there just kind of looking for it, because it can be difficult. Which kind of leads me to the first thing I want to cover and fits into this idea of how conflict can be productive, is that we first have to recognize that there is an unpleasant side of conflict, a reality of conflict. And you can look at this list. I don't have the time to dig into all of these, but I'm sure all of you can probably relate to at least something on this list. I know I certainly can, as I mentioned earlier. I'm not immune to these kinds of things. When we experience conflict, we can quickly escalate things, or we can disconnect in a way. We can blame others for the experience that we have, including the emotions that we feel. Instead of thinking about our own contribution or ownership, we can demonize people when we could actually forgive them, or we speak too much when we really should step back and listen. We can feel trapped and stuck in a conflict. We can be overly judgmental, hypocritical, passive, apathetic, defensive, and sometimes even aggressive in conflict. We can struggle a lot to listen when we're feeling attacked or accused or blamed. We can blame and shame others to kind of deflect our own sense of guilt or responsibility in the situation. We can make a lot of assumptions about people's intent, what they're trying to do, what their goals are. We can make assumptions about what the issues are. We can make assumptions about our own role within the conflict. We can really struggle to take responsibility and ownership, as I mentioned. We can really become entrenched. We can write all sorts of narratives in our own mind, and then we filter out information that confirms that or filter out information that pushes back against that narrative, and we accept only the information that continues to confirm it. We really struggle to communicate when we're in the midst of conflict and we're feeling all of those kinds of things that you just mentioned in the chat. We can resist the notion of feedback when others are trying to help us understand how we're contributing or what we might be doing that's causing the conflict. We often say things that we regret, and we don't say things that we probably should say. It can be difficult to be vulnerable in the midst of conflict and really speak from the heart, speak your truth, be vulnerable, step into that space. We all have the tendency to engage in what we call kind of false intimacy and demeaning gossip, right? Like just pretending to the person's face that everything's okay, but it's really not. And then instead of communicating directly with those that we're in conflict with, we just kind of share our thoughts and our judgments about them or the situation to others and never really address it head on. I just want to normalize this. I'm not saying that it's okay. I mean, these are some of the things that we unfortunately do in conflict, but we also should give ourselves some grace. It's difficult. Conflict's messy. It's complicated. It's challenging. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And we can fall into these traps. What we want to think about doing to make conflict productive is figuring out how we shift out of this, how we step back from some of these tendencies, how we disrupt them, how we kind of get out of our own way, and how we engage in more meaningful and effective ways with those that we might experience conflict with. So we should kind of rethink conflict in a way. We should think about it as being natural, meaning that it's going to happen. Wherever, as I mentioned earlier, there are human beings, there will be conflict. We cannot avoid that as much as we might want to. And there's kind of good reason for that. It's necessary. Conflict is often a signal that the status quo is not okay, that there's some sort of unmet need, that there's some sort of problem that deserves consideration, even though we might make sense of that problem differently, or we might think about it in its intensity in very different ways. But it's a signal that something's going on that needs to be considered. And a lot of change, development, growth, and progress that we've seen both as a society and individually in our own experiences has often been the result of some sort of conflict. Something wasn't okay. We eventually, maybe through a pretty difficult process, figured out a way to address it. And through that, we found some sort of progress, change, growth, and development. We can also think about conflict as being neutral. And this is a big theme of the session, is that we think when we reflect on it, it's overwhelmingly negative, just like we saw in the chat. We're very unlikely, for good reason, to talk about conflict as being this beautiful and wonderful thing that we should seek out because it's an opportunity for change and growth and development. But what we can think about it more as is it's this kind of neutral energy. It's like fire or electricity. When fire and electricity are channeled and addressed and approached and harnessed in the right way, they can create very meaningful things. They can help us. They can allow us to have this very presentation. They can heat our homes and help us cook our food. But if that very electricity or fire is not harnessed in the right way, is used in some sort of destructive or harmful way, it can end up being exactly that: destructive, harmful, dangerous, problematic in all sorts of ways. And so conflict's the same thing. It's this neutral energy. It's this opportunity. It's this experience that we're likely to run into. Now, what makes the difference, though, of whether it heads down that, let's just say, productive path or that destructive path? Well, a lot of that, more than we give credit to, I think, comes back to how we choose to engage, how we show up, how we address the conflict, the choices that we make in that, the choice that we make to even engage with it, often makes the difference between whether it's constructive or destructive, productive or not. And so we'll be talking about that as we continue today. I also want to not just paint conflict in this kind of wonderful light. I want to be realistic about it, just like we did on the previous slide, and say that it's also unique, right? Each conflict is unique. You could take the same issues, same set of circumstances, and interject two different people, and you have a very unique and different situation that comes with its own unique set of considerations as you move towards engaging with it. It's also complex. There's layers, right? There's as human beings, we're obviously complex. There's a lot of kind of identity-based kind of factors that come into play in conflict. There's a lot of kind of psychological elements that come up in conflict. When we talk about at interpersonal levels, there's different styles and personalities and challenges that exist there. When we're operating in terms of a certain context like the workplace, there's structures and there's systems that come into play that often can exacerbate conflict or can cause conflict in its presenting way to look like just a personality conflict or a breakdown in communication. But in reality, there's a deeper structural or systemic issue at play that is important not to ignore. But that's difficult to peel back those layers and understand conflict's complexity. Sometimes we don't always have the capacity to do that, but also just the energy, the bandwidth, the time to do that, because it is challenging. It requires a lot from us to engage in conflict, and it can be incredibly disruptive, even when the path towards resolving conflict is a meaningful one and a productive one. Again, it still takes time and energy, and that can be disruptive. What we do know, though, is that we can think about engaging in conflict in more meaningful and productive ways. We save a lot of time on the back end. And if we put in the time now when we are in the throes of conflict and we show up and we put in the energy and the work to engage in a meaningful way, it might feel like it requires a lot from us, but often it'll save us down the line as we are able to prevent further issues and problems from resurfacing. And so we've honored kind of some of the normal tendencies and some of the unfortunate reality of conflict, but we're also kind of starting to rethink it as this neutral and necessary and natural thing that we have actually a lot of control over how it plays out depending on the choices that we make about how to engage. And I say that because that means everybody who's involved. I often get the question of like, well, what if you care, Tyler, and you're doing everything that you can, the other person just doesn't care, right? Yeah, that is an obvious challenge, and we can't always influence what others do, but we still have control over how we continue to show up and engage in a situation like that, even when we feel like we're hitting a wall. So what often happens in conflict is that there is some sort of relationship, especially here in the workplace. Relationships matter. We have working relationships that exist in this context, and we spend a lot more time with people here at work than we maybe even do with folks at home or in other areas of our life. And so we develop all sorts of relationships, and there's a history there. There's either a healthiness or not to that relationship. And often there's some sort of triggering event, if you will, that brings in some sort of emotional response. And a lot of times we might engage in some sort of protective strategy, like we shut down, or we engage, escalate, we get defensive. So we either avoid or we maybe compete in a situation or somewhere in between. That's kind of the immediate reaction. And then we start to write this story to ourselves about what is this actually about? What's actually going on here? How do I see myself in this? How do I see the other in this? How do I see the issues? How do I make sense of the whole situation? We start to formulate that narrative. And depending on how we do that and how we intervene on that, we can either move towards the path of kind of mitigating the conflict, managing it productively, and eventually, hopefully, resolving it, or we can cause it to be something that is completely entrenched in some way. So you can imagine the path of you have a relationship is maybe a bit, unstable in ways. There's some sort of triggering event. Your protective strategy is to disconnect and shut down. The story you write yourself is that they're the blame. It's their fault. I haven't done anything wrong here. And then it becomes completely entrenched, and it starts to then present itself in different dynamics or different interactions that you have where you're disconnected, you're removing yourself. They start to feel the awkwardness of that, but they're not quite sure how to engage or ask you about what's going on. You're not willing to. You can just see how this continues to play out, right? So we have to think about, the reason why I even present this is because we have to think about what opportunities do we have to kind of intervene in this very basic process of conflict. There's obviously all sorts of other complexities that we could explore, but if we just think about it in this basic way, we can start to identify the areas that we can target to try to intervene, whether it's on how we manage that relationship, how we interact with that triggering event, that emotional response, and that protective strategy that we're likely to lean into, how we write the story of what's going on, and how we choose the path forward from there. So it begs this question of, well, then what do we have influence over? And it is those very things that I just mentioned. So let's unpack that a little bit further. So how we manage relationships. This on the front end of things has a big effect. How we build familiarity with people, how we build trust with people, how we build healthy patterns of communication, how we clearly articulate and identify our expectations in our working relationships, how we hold ourselves and each other accountable, how we understand what each other bring to the situation in terms of styles and preferred approaches and personalities. Just anything that comes with how we build and manage relationships in the workplace has so much to do with how conflict ends up playing out. I mean, you all know this, but just to kind of bring the point home is, if you're in a working relationship with someone that you have strong familiarity with, a positive history with, good trust, a sense of respect, an understanding of who they are and how they operate, what makes them tick and what ticks them off. Not only are you maybe unlikely to run into conflicts, but that's not just the goal, because conflict is natural, it's going to happen. When you have a relationship like that, when a conflict does come up or a disagreement comes up, you can engage in maybe some honest dialogue, some honest conversation. You can have meaningful disagreement about ideas and opinions and thoughts without it feeling like you're attacking the person, or that you are, or they are attacking you, or that you're somehow jeopardizing the relationship, or that one instance of disagreement starts people to question their whole kind of working relationship and whether or not someone likes them or respects them or cares about them. You can engage in a meaningful way. You can have a rigorous debate or disagreement, and you can walk away from it feeling okay, perhaps even strengthened in your working relationship. But also the complete opposite can happen when there isn't a foundation of trust, when people don't have a sense of respect for one another, when people don't have a sense of awareness and understanding and familiarity about each other's styles and approaches and preferences and expectations. So we could spend the rest of the session talking about just this, but obviously we won't. But I really want to just encourage people to think about like how you manage your work relationships and the kind of energy and time that you put into that to kind of save things on the or to do things on the front end that save you time on the back end when you encounter these situations of disagreements and conflicts. We also have a lot of control over how we respond to conflict in the moment, how we manage emotions. You can do a whole session on emotional intelligence and how to manage emotions, both of yours and others. But again, we don't have time for that. But I would just say, encourage people to think about what are your triggers, right? And they're probably different in different relationships and different contexts that you have. And how do you react? Are you someone that quickly does escalate, right? Are you somebody that quickly shuts down? And why is that? And what's that about? And what helps you shift out of that? And what's effective about that? And what's not effective about that kind of response? How do you manage emotions in the moment? Do you lean into them? Do you honor them? Do you see them as some sort of clue and engage with that and communicate that in the form of what we call I statements, like I feel disrespected, I feel frustrated, I feel at a loss, I feel confused, right? Or do you blame others? You're disrespectful, you're being confusing, you never make sense, right? So you let that emotional piece then kind of translate into blame of the other instead of taking ownership of that response, that emotion yourself. Do you think about things like the difference between a reaction and a response to a triggering event in the moment? And there's a lot of ways that we can unpack this, but I'll just give you one example, that the difference between a reaction and a response, even though we often think it's one's immediate, one takes more time, that's not true. A response can happen immediately. They can actually even almost look the same. The difference is that a response takes into consideration the well-being of the other, and a reaction is driven from only a more kind of selfish, kind of motivated place. And so thinking about in those kind of moments when you experience emotions and triggering events, do you respond where you take a chance to take an opportunity to advocate for your own kind of need or experience in that moment, but also take into consideration how that may impact, affect, or come across to others, and that your intention is to move things forward in a meaningful way, not to just express something for the sake of it being known, if you will. how do you think about this? All of these, again, we could unpack for a long time. So I'm just giving the crash course here. And I see some things in the chat. Let me just address real quick. Yes, a recording will be available of this. As far as I understand, I don't know. And then also, yes, I will share the slides.
And yes, we will be providing the recording.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Evan, for confirming. Yeah, so the other piece, as I mentioned, is the kind of story that we tell ourselves of the conflict. So I would just kind of encourage people to think about the stories that you often tell yourself in the midst of conflict. Are they stories that are centered around blame, centered around figuring out who's right, who's wrong? Are they stories that often put yourself either in the hero's position or the victim's position? Are there predictable kind of patterns around the narratives that you write for yourself when you find yourself in conflict? What might that be about? What is that connected to? How can you unpack and start to make sense of some of that? Why are you likely to kind of write a narrative or a story in one particular situation, but not in the other? Just really thinking about how we can intervene on and reflect on how we make sense of the conflict and the story that we tell ourselves about it, and in particular, our own role within it. Do we take time to think about, there's a system of contribution here, and I need to reflect on what my part in that is? Do we think about the influence we have over what we focus on? I'll just give the quick example of, do we focus on who's right and who's wrong? Or do we focus on what's happening here and why? And how do we move forward with addressing it in the most meaningful way that takes into consideration what's important to those involved? Also, what approaches that we have and we can use to manage or resolve the conflict? We talked a bit about kind of avoidance, so what are the downsides and what are the benefits of that? Sometimes we avoid initially in a strategic way to then engage later after we've had some time to process, think, reflect. But what also approaches do we use in terms of different processes that are available to us? Do you utilize resources like our office? Do you immediately think about more formal processes or complaints or grievances? And not to say that those things is anything wrong with them, but they can certainly quickly turn something adversarial. And is that going to be, a kind of process that you want to engage in? They can also maybe take some time. They are processes that do circle around kind of right and wrong. So is that something that you really want, is aligned with your goals and you think will address the situation? Or are there other tools that are available or processes that are available to manage the situation? And then what skills have you developed or have you thought about, and strategies have you explored to be able to engage with the situation? Most of us haven't had some sort of formal training in conflict resolution, or maybe we've had a kind of one-off session here or there, but even in our early school days, it's just not something that's often explicitly kind of talked about. Like, let's talk about how we deal with conflict, how we manage conflict. It's often just kind of assumed that we should figure out how to do that. We should know how to do that. And the reality is a lot of us adopt our tendencies and our behaviors and our habits based off of what we observed growing up and what we knew. I grew up in a household that was notorious for the silent treatment. That's how people dealt with conflict. They had an explosive event, people went silent, didn't talk to each other for hours, days, sometimes weeks at a time, until someone finally gave in, said, I'm sorry, people embraced, said it's okay, and moved on, but they never had the real conversation about why it happened in the first place. And so guess what? The same conflicts would reoccur. And so I grew up witnessing that. And so not only was I conditioned to then utilize the silent treatment as a go-to tactic, but I had to work really hard to kind of fight against that, because I knew that it wasn't healthy, it wasn't productive, it didn't actually get to the source of the conflict and resolve it. So we pick up these tendencies based off of the environment we grew up in, the kind of cultural norms and traditions and assumptions that came with that, all sorts of things. And so what strategies and skills could you explore further? Where are there gaps, right? Are you an incredibly good listener, right? Or are you somebody who doesn't necessarily actively listen, right? And can you build that skill set? Are you somebody who is really strong in a written form of communication, but have challenges kind of in the moment in a spontaneous way, communicating what's important to you, what you need, and asking questions of the other, right? And so how does that challenge things when you're in conflict and you utilize email maybe more than having direct in-person or virtual conversation with people. Just all sorts of things could be explored to think about how we build our capacity to engage in conflict in more meaningful ways. And we absolutely, the point of the slide is these are the things that we do have control over. We have control over all these things. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide actually because I covered it when I was talking about how we respond to conflict in the moment, but you'll have these slides. This is just very basic stuff about how you can kind of ground yourself in the moment when there is that triggering event and you're thinking about how you kind of maybe engage in more of a response than a reaction, things of that nature. Before I dig into this guiding principles slide and we go on to some additional content, I want to pause because I know I've thrown a lot out there and I'm moving kind of quickly and see if there are any questions at this point about what I've said thus far, either in the chat or, like I said, feel free to unmute yourself. Let's see, there is a few things in the chat. Oh gosh, what would I have done if I was in Chris Rock's position on that stage? May have been a moment to avoid in the short term to then strategically engage long term, like we mentioned. And that's, if my understanding is correctly, essentially what Chris Rock did, as well as using humor to kind of address the situation, which actually is a tactic sometimes in conflict to de-escalate things or to move through a situation of discomfort. But it's an interesting question of when we are presented with violence, which is that kind of power-based way of trying to address conflict. How do we engage on the receiving end of that? Do we engage in a kind of tit-for-tat type of way, or do we take what some people might feel like is, you know, a higher road, if you will, that doesn't continue to escalate the violent approach, but still is a way of advocating and asserting one's own position and needs. There's a lot we could unpack there. I regret that we don't have the time. And I also think, oh, that's interesting, this just came up. Yeah, there's something to be said for trying to, and this is where the engaging later might be important, trying to understand later what led to that in the first place, what led one, despite my disagreement with their approach of using violence, what is it that caused them to do that? What do I need to understand more about my role and my contribution in that? And what do they maybe need to understand more about where I was coming from? That sounds like a fruitful kind of dialogue. It can certainly be difficult to get people to that place. What if you have two different styles with the person you have conflict with? One is verbal, one needs to write. This is a great question, Lisa. So this gets back to kind of knowing, like we said, knowing where people's preferences are, styles, strengths, and being able to adjust and adapt to that. Perhaps there is a way in which both kind of styles can be honored, and you can negotiate that to be able to say, maybe it would be helpful for both of us to lay out in some written form just kind of how we see and make sense of the situation, just so that we both can take time to independently express that and then independently process that. And then would you be open to the idea of then having a conversation to discuss that further? That would be, helpful for me, that you can just kind of negotiate that, or you can recognize, I see this pattern that when disagreements come up or when conflicts come up, often there's this way of engaging that is done only through written communication. I understand that may be a thing that's comfortable. So it's about acknowledging, understanding that may be more comfortable for you, or you may feel a bit more skilled in that kind of mode of communicating. And it's important for you to probably understand, for me, that I prefer that kind of verbal communication and I feel stronger in that way. So is there a way that we could maybe honor both of those things moving forward? So a lot of it ends up being kind of a negotiation about the process that you use to try to resolve the situation. Okay, there's a lot of stuff coming in here. So let me try to address as much as I can, as efficiently as I can. How can you rewrite or check your narrative so it does not escalate a situation? Because my narratives aren't usually accurate. Yeah. So the way I like to talk about this is actually on this slide that we're seeing right now, is kind of testing your own assumptions, asking yourself, okay, acknowledge, I'm making sense of it in this way. I see it in this way. But what maybe am I missing? What maybe don't I understand? How can I test some of those assumptions that are fueling that narrative? What do I need to know a little bit more about? What do I need to understand? What have I not thought of before? You can do that yourself. There's also real strong benefit to having someone that you trust help you do that as well. I mean, it's a lot of what we do as ombuds, is helping people to kind of think about their narrative and test some of their assumptions about what might be going on and why. It's a lot easier for someone who's not you, right, to be able to kind of hold that mirror up, to kind of help you reflect on that, to maybe consider things from a different perspective. So I would strongly encourage, certainly doesn't have to be us, but someone that you trust to be able to not just tell you you're right and not just claim that they're wrong, but someone who's really there to kind of understand and to maybe challenge some of your thinking about the situation. I know I have folks in my life, both personally and professionally, that I rely on in that way. Because, I'm obviously biased. That's why I've written the narrative that I have. How about dealing with passive aggressive behaviors, those who try to avoid direct communication? Yeah, so thank you for this, Ashley. Passive aggressive comes at the intersection between indirectness and not having any tact. So if you're really tactful and really direct, we call that assertive. If you're really tactful and not direct at all, we call that passive. If you are not tactful at all and not assertive at all, that's passive. I'm sorry, not direct at all, that's passive aggressive. And if you are not tactful at all and you are very direct, that means that's often labeled as aggressive. I hope I didn't butcher that. We usually have a chart that demonstrates this. And so what we can do in these situations, there may be like some go-to strategies. If you're dealing with someone who's passive aggressive, how you can intervene on that. But my theory often is that we need to shift the conversation to be about that, to be about the behavior that we notice and the impact that it has on us. So shift off of whatever the substantive thing is that they're being passive aggressive about and just say, hey, I'm noticing this thing, or can I make an observation? Can I share some feedback, or can I express a concern or challenge that I'm having about the way that you're engaging, right? I would appreciate that it be a bit more direct. It seems like there's something that you want to share with me, but I don't want to make assumptions about what that is because it hasn't been explicit, but can we have a conversation about that? If there's something that I'm doing that's maybe preventing you from being a bit more direct with me, let me know so that I can address that. That you're just shifting the attention to that actual behavior, but not, again, in a blame and judgmental way. That's what gets us stuck. Of course, is it fair to judge that? Maybe it's not the best thing in the world. Yes, but that's not what's going to lead us to a more meaningful exchange. Are there books that we can read? Absolutely. I have some references in the slides, and I'll be happy to share, when I share the slides, a follow-up to that has a list of some additional readings. Let's see. What can you do when the other side shuts down all communication? Okay. I will address, for the sake of time, I'll address this one similarly to the passive aggressive type of thing, that you may have to shift the focus to be that. And I know that sounds not helpful because if they've shut communication down, communication isn't necessarily the key, or maybe isn't going to work. But if you shift the focus of the communication, they may be a bit more willing to engage, right? So if you just get curious about your notice that there's been disconnect, that there's been a shutdown, what is that about? Help me understand. Is there something that I've done to contribute to that, right? Just that curiosity, that wanting to understand may be something that they're more willing to engage in than the actual substantive issues. We can also explore alternatives, like maybe there is someone that we trust that they have some receptivity to, that would be willing to kind of intervene, to mediate, to maybe even check in with them to understand what the kind of disconnect or shutting down is about, so that we can kind of strategically use some other third party, if you will. So there's some things to kind of explore around that. Sometimes we have to give people, this sounds like a cop-out to the question, but sometimes we do have to give people space, right? And honor that we may be ready and eager to engage, but they're not yet for whatever reason. And perhaps when they come to a place where they're willing to engage a little bit more, then we can focus the conversation on what happened there, what led to that, what continues to cause that, how can we avoid that moving forward. Okay, and I got another question here too about, do you feel the lack of communication is the biggest factor in conflict not being resolved? Do you find it would be a useful resource to try mediation before moving to more formal processes? Yeah, So I often say that communication is the very thing that gets us in conflict, and it's also the very thing that gets us out of it. So I'm almost always going to be a fan for and someone who advocates for us thinking about the way that we literally communicate and its contribution to conflict, as well as an advocate for us engaging in direct communication to try to resolve things before we escalate it to other processes. I know that might not be fitting or perfect for every situation, but I certainly think that those attempts are really helpful. And even if they aren't successful, they're probably likely to teach us something in the process of that about ourselves, or even just forcing ourselves to engage in a difficult conversation, forcing ourselves to reflect on our own communication behaviors and how they've contributed to the situation, forcing ourselves to think about how we give feedback to others about how their communication impacts us and the effect that that has on the situation in general, or the conflict specifically, those kinds of things. So it's a great question. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit here, and then I'll save other questions for the end, but I think I've kind of butchered the time here honoring some of those questions, and that's not to blame you all. I really, really appreciate your thoughtful questions and always want to make the time for that as opposed to just plowing through content. But let me see how much I can get through here, and then hopefully there's some time at the end for us to circle back to that. So I'll save some time actually on this slide by just saying that this isn't the answer to everything, but these are some basic guiding principles. A lot of them we've already talked about in some of the content thus far and the answering to some of these questions. I think if we can ground ourselves in these things, there can be a lot of benefit to that, I'll just say. If we show up to communicate, to clarify and learn, if we develop curiosity, like I said, what's happening and why, not whose fault it is or how can we blame others in difficult moments. If we truly make a commitment to listening to others, to understand, not to respond. If we ask meaningful questions to clarify and to test our assumptions, to get more information, to understand better where people are coming from and their perspective and why it exists in the way that it does. And we acknowledge that and we reflect back what we're hearing, and we stick to things like I language, like speaking from your own perspective, your own truth. I feel upset, I feel frustrated, I feel disrespected, I feel concerned or confused when this happens, because this is the impact that it has. And so moving forward, I would like it if, right? If we speak from that place, or when you're giving feedback, this is what I observe, this is what I notice, this is what I need, this is what the impact that it's having on me. We can kind of stay away from that place of accusations and blame. If we can talk about not just what we need, but why, we get to focusing on not just positions, but interests. Positions are what we want in a situation, what outcomes we're looking for. Interests are why we want them. The reason why it's so important to focus on that is because interests open up the conversation. Positions often start it. I want this, well, I want that. Okay, well, what do we do? Well, I want this because here's what it would do for me, and here's why it's important for me, and here's what need it maybe satisfies. Oh, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. This is why I'm looking for what I want. Okay, maybe there's some intersection between the different interests that we have, and we could pursue a path forward that honors those different things in a way that's different from what we originally thought needed to happen. So there's real benefit in kind of taking that deeper dive to look at interests and not positions. So when we do these things, I think we can kind of ground ourselves in better kind of conflict management, communication practices, if you will. I wish we had more time to take a deeper dive into each of these, but it can be a slide that you can use to kind of reflect on, like, do I show up in these ways? Do I focus on these things? If not, that's okay, but what can I do to maybe pay more attention to that? Or you can reflect in certain situations that you face. Am I doing this? Am I paying attention to the emotions and what they signal? Am I expressing a desire to understand where the other's coming from? Am I really listening to them? Am I being okay with acknowledging where they're coming from, what's important to them, and not feeling like that has to signal some sort of agreement because it doesn't? These kinds of things can be really powerful. But to get a bit more specific here, balancing in advocacy and inquiry. I'm sorry, I just saw a comment about that. Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so that's just a fancy way really of saying, like, that you're paying attention to both talking about what you need and what's important to you and why you see a situation the way that you do, but you're also equally curious about how the other person or other people see the situation and what they need and what's important to them as well, right? That you're not putting too much emphasis on one. If you put too much emphasis on them, then you're probably just thinking about accommodating. If you're putting too much emphasis on your own, you're probably coming across as kind of too competitive, too adversarial, too much I need to win, right? And so if you balance those two things, you kind of find a path towards more of a collaborative way of engaging. And that's important to do even when we feel certain about things, even when we feel, convinced that we're right and we're wrong. Can we still make a commitment to understand, well, where might they be coming from? Why was this maybe important for them in terms of the decision that they made, or the choice that they made, or the behavior that they demonstrated, or the way that they chose to engage? Okay, so I want to talk about a particular framework that we can think about when it comes to engaging in conflict and leaning into what we often hear is kind of difficult conversations. And this comes from an excellent book someone mentioned earlier, additional reads, called Difficult Conversations. It was written by Sheila Heen and Douglas Stone back in 2011, I think was the most recently published version. They talk about shifting from a battle of messages to what they call a learning conversation. And I'll move through this relatively quickly, but there's three parts to a learning conversation. There's the kind of what happened, the feelings, and then the identity factor. So kind of what's the story, like we talked about earlier, what should we do with the emotions that we feel, and what does this situation kind of say about me and about others? And there's challenges that come with each of these kind of components of the conversation. Like when it comes to the what happened, is that usually there's more to the situation than you understand, and that it's complex, and that each one of you has only maybe a sliver of the whole kind of pie, if you will, of understanding, what really is going on. The challenge with the feelings is that, emotions are difficult. They're, situations are emotionally charged and can be really difficult to manage that. And the identity piece can cut really deep when things trigger, identity-based factors. And it threatens our sense of identity. That can be a really difficult thing to wrestle with. And so what we can think about, though, is shifting from a set of assumptions and goals that create what we call a battle of messages, something very adversarial, to a set of assumptions and goals that create more of a learning conversation. So just to preview a few of these on the what happened kind of conversation, the assumptions that might come with that is, look, I know all I need to know and understand about what happened, and I just need to persuade them that I'm right. But a learning conversation would acknowledge and would assume, rather, that each of us is bringing different information and perceptions to the table. There are likely to be important things that each of us doesn't know, and the goal should be to explore each other's stories, how we understand the situation, and why. Or the assumption that I know what they intended, and I just need to let them know what they did was wrong, can be shifted to, I know what I intended and the impact that their actions had on me, but I don't know, and I can't know kind of what's going on in their head and what they actually intended. And why they did what they did. And so the goal would be to share the impact that they had on you and whatever they did, and find out what they were thinking and what caused them to do that, and also to find out what potential impact you might be having on them. Or to shift from the assumption that, look, it's all their fault or it's all my fault, and the goal is to, to get them to admit their responsibility or take blame in the situation, or vice versa. Could shift to the assumption of, look, we probably have both contributed to this mess. Like I talked about earlier, there's this like system of contribution, and there's enough to go around. So our goal is to kind of understand that system of contribution and how our different actions produce the results that we experienced. And in the feelings side, instead of the assumption that like feelings aren't irrelevant, we shouldn't talk about the emotions, it wouldn't be helpful to share that, or my feelings are their fault, I'm blaming them for that, and they need to know about that. And the goal being avoiding it altogether, really letting them have it. A learning conversation would deal with feelings in a way that assumes, look, feelings are actually at the heart of this situation. We cannot avoid it, and they're usually complex. So we might have to dig a bit to understand both ours and theirs, what's causing them. And the goal is to address them, again, mine and theirs, without judgment or attribution. Acknowledge feelings, and de-escalate things before we shift into a place of trying to think about the future and problem solve. And on the identity side of the conversation, we can shift from that battle of messages where the assumption is, look, I'm either competent or incompetent, good, bad, likable, unlikable, there's no in between. It's just this very kind of either or kind of way of thinking. So it's either like protect my all or nothing image. So we can think about this sometimes in conflict that has to do with feedback, right? So you get feedback and it doesn't land in this good way, and it like starts to take you down this road of self-doubt about your competence, about whether they like you, all sorts of things, right? And so like the goal then becomes either to just avoid because that's too uncomfortable, or try to rescue that, try to salvage that, right? Or it's the complete opposite. We feel like, how dare you threaten or question this certain aspect of my identity or the quality of my work. I am competent, I am good, people do like me, right? And you just need to understand that, and I need to get you to buy into that. That it's not so cut and dry like that. That instead, the learning conversation would assume, look, there may be a lot of stake psychologically and otherwise for both of us here. Each of us is complex, just like those emotions, and neither of us are perfect in this. And so the goal is to understand what identity issues might be at stake or on the line for each of us, and to build a more kind of complex sense of self-image to maintain a balance. That yes, maybe this feedback, although I disagree with it, is important to take into consideration in some way. And that doesn't mean that I have to totally question my sense of identity as an ombuds, right? Just because someone gave me feedback that they didn't appreciate the way that I helped them or the way that I said something or whatever, doesn't mean that I need to defend myself. It is probably helpful for me to take that into consideration and to understand where they're coming from and why they gave that feedback. And I don't have to continue down this rabbit hole of self-doubt and question whether or not I should continue my career as an ombuds. So I think it's really important for us to think about as we're engaging in communication and difficult conversation as an important element of managing and conflict and trying to make it productive. How do we shift from this sense of a battle of messages to a learning conversation? So we've gone through what some of the assumptions and goals are that might be connected to two of those very different kinds of approaches. So I know that was quick. I kind of regret, I feel like I moved through the material very quickly. I regret that we don't have some more time for kind of interaction and discussion around this, but I do see we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. So I want to try to get as many questions in as I can. I really appreciated the ones that we checked in about halfway. I'm hoping we'll continue to have some more here. And let me just say this before I go there. Again, I know we just kind of scratched the surface today about thinking about what it means to engage in conflict more productively. I know we talked more about like our thinking about conflict and the situation and others and the issues and ourselves, and less about kind of like practical, what do we literally do? But there's some intention around that, not just because there's only time for so much, but we have to start there. We have to reorient ourselves. We have to question our thinking about conflict, our assumptions about conflict, our relationship with conflict, our tendencies in conflict, before we can really lean into, in a meaningful way, adopting new behaviors and strategies. Okay. All right, there's a lot coming in here. Let me see what I can go through here. And Evan, if you don't mind helping me, like just make sure I don't miss anything glaringly obvious, I would really appreciate that. In a fast-paced office with immediate and short deadlines, doing these processes become more difficult. Advice. Yeah. So one of the enemies of collaboration is time. There's no doubt about that. So I would say that, short of kind of a collaborative approach, which is a lot of what we talked about today, compromises are okay, right? Like where you're just trying to find, that intersection of different needs. And maybe it's like the classic splitting the pie, last piece of pie down the middle, right? Everybody's not going to get all of what they want, and they're going to have to sacrifice a little bit, but at least people can walk away happy. So sometimes in a fast-paced environment, you have to just kind of quickly negotiate those kind of compromise outcomes. But here's the other thing. To the extent that people can periodically pause, take a step back and reflect on certain dynamics and have conversations about them, like kind of separate from that immediate space where the interactions you're having are about like actual incidents and issues, and just step back and talk about like experiences people have in general and processes that are used and the benefits and the challenges with that in trying to manage conflicts and disagreements, that those kind of pause, step back moments can save time down the line and may be worth it to take some of that time. And I'm happy to explore, and anyone in our office really, other ways in which people in more of a kind of fast-paced environment might implement some of these strategies in a way that accommodates some of that. So thank you for that question, Paul. Is it possible for you to present on this topic at one of our offices' lunch and learns? Yes, we do these presentations in all sorts of ways. So if you have a specific group that you're interested in a presentation like this for, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about setting something like that up. I will be honest, we don't believe in the idea of just training problems away. So a lot of times, people maybe want to do a presentation or a workshop because they think that'll get the message to people and resolve the conflict that's actually going on. That's kind of the elephant in the room. What we would rather do is work with that group directly to kind of figure out how to address that thing and avoid trying to do a presentation as a way to kind of like indirectly address it. But then I understand there are times where people are just purely interested in this from kind of a professional development standpoint. We're happy to do stuff like that. Wow, lots of questions here. Okay. I've always found that two-way communication is extremely important. For example, repeating back to the other individual what you thought you heard. Yes, absolutely. Reflective listening is a foundational and critical skill in managed conflicts. That means not only listening to understand and to really hear where the other person's coming from and what's important to them, but to reflect back what that is. We know that that helps de-escalate situations. And when we de-escalate situations, that shifts people into a place where they're ready to more in a position where they're ready to problem solve in a more effective way. What can you do with colleagues and supervisors who try to engage you to commit illegal activity in a way that they get rewards and you get the liability? You're law-abiding and this is repetitive behavior. Okay, so yeah, that's a significant one. That's certainly one that would be delicate and tricky to navigate, to kind of how to protect yourself, stand up for yourself, push back against what you see as those activities without putting yourself in some sort of risk, jeopardy, consequence. I would say that's one that we would probably benefit from talking about more specifically, because there's a lot of considerations to be made given what the actual details of that situation are. So I don't mean to skirt the question, but to the extent that we could be helpful in a more direct, specific, one-on-one working with the Ombuds office way, I certainly encourage that. Always gives excellent presentations, but I feel as though he's often having to plow through a mild material. That's interesting. I love to see webinar series. Yes, thank you, Rachel. That part of that's on me too, about time management and biting off a little bit more than I can chew. But thank you for the positive feedback. And yes, I'm hoping to explore in the future ways in which these topics can be given the kind of adequate time that they often need. Thank you. Does all of this apply to toxic people relationships? That's one I got. Yes, I mean, yes, it does. To an extent, right? There's certain things where these strategies and tactics may just not, at the end of the day, be the thing that resolves it or addresses it. But when we think about relationships in all aspects of our lives, these strategies can be widely applicable. I will send books. Leah, thank you for endorsing the idea of webinars.
Yeah.
Let's see what else is coming here. Oh, just thanks. Okay.
We're actually at time.
There we are. Yeah, we are.
We're at time. So this has been great. I want to thank you so much, Tyler, for coming and presenting on this topic. We will be posting the recording to our ODEO webpage and sharing it with all the attendees. So the slide deck and the recording.
Excellent. Evan, thank you so much for your help with coordinating, and thank you, Leah, for the invite. And also, if folks have questions that they didn't want to ask in this setting, but want to follow up with me directly, as promised, my contact information is on the slides, and I'll make sure that they're available to everyone. So thank you all so much for being here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and hope to see folks around.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.